behind the walls. I mean, so actually you send it once in a while, so that's where one gets to read them.
Behind a wall?
Your paywall, no? Business Standard is behind paywall.
Oh, but I circulate it
I know.
usually
Yeah,
like a
that's how
PDF.
yeah, that's how I get
yeah.
tips.
Yeah.
And Nainan has allowed his weekend ruminations to be carried on the print website, so you can get that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. Mm.
Somebody's on chat, but is the chat for? Okay, so the chat is also activated. Alka Acharya has been sending messages.
Yeah, the chat as well. Yeah. Okay, so we'll just give it another minute and then we'll start. Super. So we can begin. Yes. Great. Good morning, everyone, and a very, very warm welcome to the Center for Policy Research's webinar series. We bring to you today a very, very important discussion titled India's Economic Engagement in Asia, How Should It Change After Ladakh? We bring this webinar against the backdrop of two crucial developments that are likely to shape the future of India's relationships within Asia. First, of course, the COVID pandemic and its larger economic impact, not only on India, but also on the region and the globe. And second, the happenings on our border and the crisis that is now slowly abating between India and China, the military crisis, that is also set to press a significant reset button, not only on India's relationships with China, but also on how the region realigns itself both strategically and economically. To discuss these issues, it's an absolute privilege for the Center for Policy Research to have together such an esteemed set of panelists. We have today to discuss these issues, Ambassador Shyam Saran, who's a former Foreign Secretary and Senior Fellow at the Center for Policy Research, Dr. C. Raja Mohan, Director, Institute of South Asian Studies, Singapore. It's a pleasure to have Dr. Mohan back also because he has a past history with the Center for Policy Research. So it's always lovely to have our old colleagues back here. So a very warm welcome to you, Raja, and thank you for coming. We also have Ambassador Mohan Kumar, Chairperson of the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, a fellow think tanker as well now. So lovely to have you with us, I think, for the first time at the CPR, and look forward to this being the start of many more conversations and engagements, both with you and with RIS. And Dr. Suman Berry, former Director General of the National Council of Applied Economic Research. Suman is also an old friend of the center. And we, in fact, have had a long ongoing conversation with him on these issues. And in fact, I owe Suman a great thanks, because part of the motivation for this conversation, in fact, a significant motivation for this webinar, came from Suman and from a report that Suman has authored along with colleagues that he will be talking about in his remarks, that looks really at India's economic engagements within the region, both in the context of RCEP, as well as the larger questions of health diplomacy that we now confront post-COVID. So thank you all for being here, and look forward to the discussions. Just a couple of housekeeping rules for everyone, since we are all on online rather than in person. We will go through a few rounds of discussion with the panelists. All panelists will offer some opening remarks within about 5 to 7 minutes, followed by another round of discussion to get the conversation going. And once we go through the panelists' remarks, we will open it up for questions and answers. I would like to request all those registered and listening in to please put their questions in the Q&A box. My colleague Sparsh, who is also on this call, and I will go through the questions and try to make sure that we pose as many of them as possible to the panelists within the time constraints. So please do be brief in your questions, because it will help us go through them and cluster them together through the course of the discussion. So thank you, everyone. And we'll kick off. Let me first invite Raja to open us, to give us some opening remarks. Raja, to sort of place both the changing nature of India's relationships within Asia in the larger context of India's geostrategic thinking, but also, of course, to touch upon the events of the last few weeks and how these then also reshape these larger geostrategic context in which we are talking about India's economic diplomacy. Over to you, Raja.
Thank you, Yamini. Delighted to be back at CPR, and it's a privilege to be part of such a very distinguished panel. What I'll do is really to look at the larger international context in which the Galwan and India's response to it has taken place, and how the global dynamic will intersect with India's, and what are the kind of choices that it leaves India in dealing with our engagement with Asia and the international system. So I would say the external context, I think it's quite clearly the post-Cold War moment. I think if we go back to 89, 91, the assumptions that rest of the world operated at that point of time, that globalization is here to stay, and there is no longer a division among the major powers. Everyone is getting along with everybody else, and the world is expanding its multilateral and the system with its trade, economics, and international institutions. But I think that presumption has broken down. So I think we got to be quite clear how much the RCEP was a great achievement. It doesn't square with what is happening with other trade agreements, and there is a deep crisis in globalization. I mean, I think you could trace it back to 2016, whether it was Brexit, Mr. Trump, that the losers from globalization within the West or the advanced countries, especially the United States, are struck back in 2016. Mm-hmm. And the problem that how do you resolve this tension that if globalization doesn't work for the most important country in the world, it is seeking to rearrange the rules. Now, where that game is at this point of time, Mr. Trump has challenged the global order, economic order, and Biden's talk about replacing it, or going back to restoring the world order is not simply credible at this stage because his own party, the Democratic Party, is deeply divided between those who seek more equity and justice at home and limit some of the external exposure to the economy, while the capital, the dominant economic forces which seek restoration of pre-Trump a global economic order. And that's a battle that will continue during the election. And I think we'll only know that. Whether for good or bad, the question is, are societies merely units of economic efficiency, or are they societies, communities with some values? That is a question being asked, because until now we said efficiency, efficiency, efficiency is everything. Capital should move anywhere it likes, labor will move anywhere it likes, and the resulting benefits is what the world is going to be happy, forever happy place. We now know it is not. Therefore, the questioning in domestic politics, and a questioning in which China has become central to that argument within the US. So therefore, we are in the integration of China into the WTO and the interdependence that was generated is now a serious economic problem. It is a political problem for a section of the Americans. And I think that battle will be fought out in this election, and we'll see what comes out of it. But then this is a huge change that has taken place. And I think our own attitudes and policies must keep this in mind. The second, the end of the Cold War saw end of great power rivalries, but now they're back. And essentially, it's a US-China geopolitical contestation. The rapid rise of China has produced a new dynamic today. And the fact that China, at least Americans believe, a large section, China has gained the WTO, is trying to gain hegemony over Asia, it's dominating international institutions, therefore the US ought to push back, and some of that pushback is taking place. But whether the decoupling will actually succeed, whether they can redo the global order or to go back to an order in which the US or the West were dominant, it's by no means clear. So therefore, the problem of rearranging the global system, whether it is in the regional domain or in the global multilateral institutions, from WTO to WHO, every one of this is today open for negotiation. And as we said, if the institutions don't work for the guy who set them up, he's saying, I want change of rules. Now, whether Mr. Biden will simply go back or will he has to make accommodations internally. So therefore, the internal conflict in US is going to have a big bearing on how the geopolitical dimension too will come back. Coming to Asia, and I think the Asians in East Asia say, we don't want to choose sides. They say, look, they don't like the divorce between the Americans and the Chinese. So please stay where you are. It's been great for us for 45 years. US-China cooperation has done great, brought prosperity, stability to Asia. So nobody would want to see that go back. But then we don't control the internal dynamics in the East Asia. In what happens in Washington, what happens in Beijing is not under the control of the Asian countries. So therefore, they have to adapt, whether we like it or not. If this goes too far out, I think we have to, the countries in the region have no choice but to adapt. And meanwhile, on the political side, all of them are on the receiving end from the Chinese strategic assertion, whether South China Sea, East China Sea, or a range of issues here. So now, since the Chinese don't seem to think they need to be nice to anyone, that the fact is their power is so much bigger than the rest. So whether it is East China with the Japanese, with Indonesians, with Indians, so there is a sense of their arrival. So they're not holding their punches back. So we are in a situation. So now, how do these trends intersect with what we've done? I think one of the interesting things in Galwan and after one, India stood up militarily. I think a full-blown response on the military side. And it has escalated the conflict horizontally to include the economic dimension. So this is something, probably, I don't know if it's expected or unexpected, wise or unwise, but India has thrown the gauntlet that, look, if you push us too far, we will do decoupling. So what was hidden, implicit in the RCEP decision today becomes a far more explicit part of the response to what India is doing in relation to a Chinese assertion. Of course, India has been facing the Chinese economic problem. India has been facing the Chinese geopolitical advance in South Asia and the Indian Ocean, and on the boundary where the balance has seemed to have shifted to the Chinese side. So India confronts a fundamentally different situation vis-a-vis China, never had a great power on its borders. Today it faces a powerful economic strategic entity on its borders, not just in the north, but in the Indian Ocean as well. So therefore, where does this take us? I think I will just quickly touch on three issues. I think one, it is not a question of whether we retreat from Asia we go back from globalization to self-reliance or self-sufficiency. You know, there is a whole lot of debate on that. But I think there is a path. We have to find a path in between, because you can't go back to 1930s, or you can go back to the 1970s, that while you are today already exposed to the world, therefore, is there a path in between, between complete retreat from globalization? How are you going to adapt to that? If you recognize that the international economic system is changing and the geopolitics are changing, then internally, what we've seen happen in the last few years is really, there is no longer a consensus that 1991 is the way we're going to go for the next 20 years. That's a political call. I mean, you and I can't change that. Quite clearly, a judgment has been made. Keeping it open has harmed us. So therefore, is there something in between? That is there a different way we can deal with the economic policy and engagement? Is there a different way we can, the assumption that we can be nice to everyone and everyone will be nice to us on the geopolitical side, that too has been squashed by the Galwan crisis. So therefore, this leaves, I think, fundamentally, I think we are at a position since 1991 for the first time, the economic policy challenges and the strategic policy challenges are stark. And there, how we deal with them, I think is going to be the story for the next many years and decades. And there I would say, I'll take the liberty of saying 3 quick things on the economic side, what we could do perhaps. That if you don't make yourself attractive, it doesn't matter whether you're inside RCEP or outside RCEP, or you're doing trading arrangements. Because if internally, if we don't dismantle the over-regulatory administrative state, we can keep talking, I mean, the rest of it, but you will be retreating without actually retreating. So therefore, without internal economic reform, you're not going to go anywhere. Second, I think we need to do some trade. If you're not doing RCEP, we've been spinning the Americans around, we've been spinning the Europeans around. Is there, at least formally we've said, we want to do trade agreements with Americans, with Australians, with the Europeans. If we show some movement there, I think the rest of the world will see, look, India is still interested in connecting with the rest of the world. And then there is the bilateral trading arrangement with Asians. If you're negotiated with them on RCEP, maybe there's room to do a lot of things bilaterally with a lot of them. So if you do that, then I think it opens up a path for us. And then finally, they talk about changing the supply chains. The idea of a G11 or G10, the idea of a D10 dealing with 5G and telecom technology. The idea that, look, it is not everyone and happily in a WTO family, but like-minded countries working together. At least some ideas have been floated, but I think it's something that India ought to explore and to see where that takes us. So internal reform, renewed trade expansion with countries, at least over, we have good relationship with, and to actively participate in rearranging the global economic system, global multilateral system. I think all 3 become urgent priorities. I'll stop here, Yamini.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Raja, for so succinctly giving us the big picture, laying out the kinds of transformations that the globe is undergoing, and what that means for India, what it also means for shaping India's relationships within Asia and with China, but also bringing in the domestic story and bridging the gap between the kinds of choices and steps we need to take domestically as so crucial to how we position ourselves within this wider geostrategic debate. Ambassador Saran, if I could turn to you now, both to offer your reflections on the larger geostrategic picture as Raja laid out for us, but also to give us a sense of really what's at stake here for India, especially in the context of the developments of the last 2-3 weeks vis-a-vis our relationship with China, our economic response as well to the military challenges that we've been facing on the border as well, and what implications this is going to have on how we engage within the region, we're both bilaterally as well as potentially in the form of regional trade agreements and so on. So over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Yamini, and it's a rare privilege for me to have this opportunity of being on the same panel with some very distinguished scholars like Raja Mohan, my colleague from the Foreign Service, Ambassador Mohan Kumar, and of course my old friend Suman Berry, who I would like to thank for in fact taking the initiative of organizing this interaction. So let me begin by agreeing with Raja. His sort of sketching out of the geopolitical environment. I think nobody would disagree with that. What I perhaps look at in a somewhat different perspective is the globalization aspect, because yes, it is true that there is a backlash against globalization. Yes, it is true that the COVID-19 pandemic has, in a sense, accentuated that retreat from globalization. And we are seeing the intensification of a lot of the protectionist sentiment, even in major countries. But I still remain convinced that globalization is a bell which cannot be unrung. That it is something which is inherent in the kind of technological advancement which is taking place, which has taken place, and which will continue to take place. Yes, there have been sort of unwanted consequences of this process of globalization, and Raja drew attention to the fact that the losers from this globalization trend are the ones who are no longer ready to accept, the efficiency argument against the kind of, loss of dignity, if you can say, the loss of, any sort of prospect of their children, for example, having better life than they themselves have had. That is very real. But, this is not to be laid at the door of globalization. It has to be laid at the door of failure of public policy. The gains which have been generated by globalization, and these are very substantial gains. I mean, in our own country itself, the kind of poverty alleviation and poverty eradication which we have seen. Why is China today where it is? China today is one of the biggest advertisements of globalization. So I don't think that we should neglect that aspect of globalization, but I think the lesson which we are drawing from what we are confronted with today, the lesson is not that globalization must therefore be completely reversed, but in fact the lesson is globalization has to be accompanied by a very serious attention now in the post-COVID environment to public policy, to the responsibility of the state, which, by the way, we all agree has gained in power and authority as a result of this pandemic, whether we like it or not. So I think we also need to be able to see, can we now look at designing public policies which in fact ameliorate some of the negative consequences of globalization and enables a much larger community, much more inclusively to enjoy the fruits of globalization. So I do not see the future as one where the greater fragmentation of the globe is what is the answer to the kind of challenges which we face. And this is also important because it's not just globalization. It is the fact that most of the challenges that you are facing today, of which the COVID-19 itself is a very good example, many of the other even bigger challenges you might be facing in the future, such as climate change, are all global in dimension. And unless you design global responses and global collaborative responses, your ability to, in fact, resolve those problems is very limited. Even today we see with respect to the pandemic. While the response should have been global in nature, while there should have been a pooling together of the intellectual, of the financial resources of the countries of the world to deal with this scourge of pandemic, we are seeing a completely fragmented response. So even if that is the reality on the ground, it does not mean that we should simply say, okay, there is not much that I can do about it. And this is where I think if there is a role for India, given its credentials as a country which has been internationally very active, despite its power quotient, it has been a very important country on the international stage, on the stage of the UN. It has repeatedly reaffirmed its faith in multilateralism. While you have to pay the geopolitical game, there is a contestation that you will have to take care of. But there is that larger dimension which we should not neglect, because eventually that larger dimension is really going to be fundamental to how India is able to safeguard and promote its interests. So this is the larger picture that I looked at. And in terms of the specific question which has been asked, what is likely to change or should change in India's posture towards Asia after Ladakh? I would say that it shows that you need to have much greater engagement with Southeast Asia, much greater engagement with your Asian neighborhood than you have today. Because any hope of being able to project yourself as a credible, countervailing presence to China, as a much more attractive partner compared to China, unless you have much deeper engagement with this region, you will not be able to play that role. So the question of choice is here. Now, okay, RCEP, you are not prepared to face a China which could be in reality like a free trade agreement with India. Raja has mentioned, and I agree, that we should be looking at options like a free trade agreement with US or a free trade agreement with the EU. But let me make the point that RCEP was actually a very low quality trading arrangement. The demands on you in the RCEP were very much less than, for example, the TPP or the legacy of the TPP, the so-called high quality trading arrangement that we were talking about, which were not really focused on tariffs. They were focused on things like standards, things like phytosanitary standards, regulatory measures, how do you treat public procurement. None of those we were ready to really concede on. So RCEP was, in a sense, the minimum that the countries at different levels of development could agree upon. If you could not accept the kind of standards that the RCEP was contemplating, please tell me, how are you going to be able to do that with the EU or with the Americans, whose demands are much more? The kind of standards that they want in terms of, say, public procurement, or in terms of, hygiene standards that you need to have. All these are much, much more demanding than in the case of the RCEP. I do not have any sense, either from the United States or from the EU, that they are ready to, in some way, dilute those standards in order to accommodate you. Maybe we should try. I am not saying that we should accept it as a given, but I do not have a sense that any geopolitical advantage is something that will lead these major powers and democracies to actually make concessions to India on the trading front. So that is something to be tested. And lastly, I would like to make the point that I have argued, again and again, that there seems to be somehow an assumption in India that you can substitute the economic engagement or your economic presence in the region by a greater security sort of profile. I'm afraid that it does not work that way. Both are absolutely essential pillars in terms of how you deal with the region. And yes, the Asian countries have had it very good so far, that they have been able to benefit with much greater sort of economic interaction with China in terms of trade, in terms of investment, and they have also benefited from a continuing strong security presence by the United States. But that comfortable situation, as I think Raja also pointed out, that is something which is already changing. And the Asian countries have no option but to try and adjust to that. But the question is, how will they adjust? Now, my sense is, even though this is a bit of a cynical argument, my sense is that the countries on our East Asian flank will probably, because of the very strong interests involved, they will almost inevitably fall within a Chinese-dominated, regional architecture. Unless some very major sort of countervailing responses are made, this to me seems to be the direction in which we are moving. So this is a reality which I think we need to accept, precisely because there is not much agency that the countries in Southeast Asia, East Asia have in terms of being able to deal with the reality of Chinese power. So I see, for example, as evidence of this, much of the kind of interaction which is taking place over the last 5-6 years between China and Japan. Despite the security challenge which Japan, confronts vis-a-vis China, but in fact there has been a greater, there has been actually an increase in the density of cross investment of trade between China and Japan, which we may not have perhaps anticipated. So we should take a realistic note of what kind of a situation we are faced with, and the answer to that, forgive me if I repeat this again, the answer to that is not, in fact, limiting our engagement, economic engagement with the rest of Asia, but in fact expanding it. And lastly, I would say no country in the recent past has actually been able to develop and reach some level of prosperity without having a very, very dynamic export economy, without having, being a very attractive target, as Raja pointed out, for foreign investment. Yes, of course, you need to make very, very major economic reforms. But I suspect that the Atmanirbhar Bharat is not the direction, is not something or a strategy which is going to be taking us in that direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Saran. I think Mohan, he makes a very important and provocative statement when he says that we can't substitute economic engagement with strategic engagement. If you could just reflect a little bit on that, and also push us a little forward on if that is indeed the case, and we do need to be thinking differently about economic engagement in the region and frankly across the globe, what should be the contours of that arrangement, given the limitations that we have in our domestic context? I think Raja is right that a lot of the 1991 political consensus is up for grabs. There is a global reshaping and reordering of economies that has already been taking place pre-COVID and will only get accelerated post-COVID. And also there are sets of internal limitations of the 1991 economic consequences within India and the sharp inequalities that it reflected that do cause momentary pause and strengthen the political consensus saying we need to relook. Are we relooking in the right direction? Where do we need to go? Some thoughts from you?
Thank you, Yamini, and it's a great pleasure to be on the CPR platform for the first time. I hope it will not be the last, so look forward to those discussions in the future. I'm almost overawed because one of the panelists is my former boss, the other is a strategic guru, and the third is an economist I idolize. So you've put me in the middle of, all these great stalwarts. So, but I'm going to speak my mind. Anybody who knows me knows that I'm not going to hold back. So I will tell you and I will address some of the issues. A lot of the points that Dr. Raja Mohan and Ambassador Shyam Saran made, I have no problem, especially the one about India having to make itself attractive. I think that's absolutely something we should nail. Secondly, nobody is talking about a disengagement in economic terms from Asia, but there are going to be some important differences with what others have said. So if you allow me, let me make my propositions. I said to you that I will, some of them will appear provocative, but I suppose that is the whole idea of a debate like this. So the first proposition that I would like to make is that I think post-COVID, it seems to be almost a given that trade, technology, and investment ties are going to be reciprocal, preferential, and strategic. They are no longer going to be done on the basis of just economics. So both, I mean, all the three, trade, technology, investment will be preferential. It will be reciprocal. It will be strategic. I don't think there is any getting away from it. COVID has accelerated this. The second one is, I think, something that Dr. Raja Mohan referred to, which is the ASEAN, having had this sweet spot. Ambassador Shyam spoke of it as well. I also agree with both of them. And I think the time has come when it's going to be difficult for countries to say, you are an economic partner of choice, and we are going to have a strategic partner of choice who's going to be different. And I think the both of them are going to merge. And this will have implications for India's trade policy. The third one, which is actually an important conventional wisdom, which is that if you have economic ties with a country, it makes military conflict less likely. I think the Chinese have busted this conventional wisdom in Galwan. We have a huge deficit with China. We have $100 billion trade with China, and they go and do Galwan. So anybody who now tells me you must have economic relationships with countries and that will make military conflict less likely, you look at how China and the US are behaving, look at how China and India are behaving, and look at how China is doing what it is doing in South China Sea. So I think that theory is now finished. That is my third provocative proposition. Fourth, so in terms of this, what does India do? I think India will have to pick strategic partners of choice in Asia. This will include ASEAN. We have an FTA with ASEAN, and we're going to have a review of the FTA. And I agree with Ambassador Shyam Saran and others. We must deepen the engagement so that we can make it commensurate with all the strategic talk that we are doing. We will have to strengthen relationships with Korea, Japan, both of whom we have a comprehensive economic partnership agreement. An FTA with Australia can be done quite easily, in my humble view. I don't belong to the government, so I'm speaking personally, but I think that is something we can do. And I would push for an FTA with Taiwan. Taiwan has a special economic arrangement with New Zealand and Singapore. I don't see why India should not push for an FTA with Taiwan. These will be the strategic partners of choice for India. You can see I have omitted an important country. We will come to it later. But this is Asia for me. We already have ties with these countries, and I will seek to strengthen economic relationship with these countries to kind of agree with what others have said, which is that we must bring our economic relationship in consonance with what we are doing strategically or what we are hoping to do strategically with these countries. Three other guesstimates, if you like, or speculation. One, I believe India-China ties will change irrevocably post-Galwan. To expect it to go back to status quo ante is naive, in my view. It is going to change. We can talk about the extent of change and what changes later on. The second point I want to make in this segment is RCEP. I think it's a ship that has sailed. Again, it's my personal view. I think the ship has sailed for India, for good or worse. We can talk about the opportunity missed. There could be a counterpoint of view. Finally, and this is the most important thing that this session has to address. Are we looking at a China-centric Asia, or are we looking at a polycentric Asia? If it is a China-centric Asia, and if it means ASEAN and other countries are going to do what Ambassador Shyam Saran said they would do, I I have a disagreement with that, but he may be right. I mean, this is not mathematics where he's right and I'm wrong. It's possible that these countries make this choice, that they will come under the Chinese sphere of influence. I'm sorry, India will have a grave problem with that. What we will be able to do, what the price or cost that we will pay, I don't know. But we will not be in favor of a China-centric Asia if that is what all these partners want. We will want a polycentric Asia. And this regard, I wanted to point out to an article that you had sent, Yamini. I think it was the editors of the East Asia Forum, 6th July. One of the statements caught my eye. It said, for India to achieve the vision of its rightful place in a multipolar world, Delhi will have to find a way to accommodate China. You know what they say in foreign policy, where you stand on an issue depends on where you sit. In East Asia, they believe Delhi will have to find a way to accommodate China. I find that very amusing because post Galwan, it is Delhi which is going to say China will have to find a way to accommodate the rise of India if you want a polycentric Asia. Otherwise, the game is over. So I'm not saying the choices confronting India are easy. I'm not even saying the choices confronting India are necessarily those that are going to help India, but some of these decisions will have to be made. And a lot will depend, I believe, on what ASEAN, China, Korea do. I'm very clear about who my strategic partners are. I mean, we can talk about US, EU later, but since this is about Asia, I think there are preferred strategic partners in Asia for India with whom we can try and engage and augment trade, investment, and technology relationship. The 5G issue, for example, is a clear illustration of what I'm trying to say. Anybody who tells me that 5G will have to be decided on the basis of L1 has got to be out of his mind. You know, China has announced its 5G partnerships domestically. 50% has been given to Huawei, 35% has been given to ZTE, another Chinese company. A token has been given to Ericsson Nokia. Singapore has said the core aspects of 5G will be given to Ericsson Nokia and non-core aspects will be given to Huawei. But that is because Singapore came under enormous pressure from China. India doesn't have that burden. Because we are starting from zero virtually, we can really make these choices without any encumbrance. So I'll stop here, Yamini, but I hope I've said enough to at least provoke a debate, and we can take it up later in your question and answer. But again, thank you so much for this opportunity with what I can only call an absolutely stellar panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohan, for that rightly provocative set of comments, which I think lead us very well into Suman's remarks. Suman, the floor is open for you to reflect both on what has been said, but also more specifically on the emerging dynamics of India's economic relationships within the region. And I'm keen to hear from you, particularly on the very provocative statement that Mohan made, which is that, in some senses, the RCEP ship has sailed. Let's not try and hold back try to hitch our wagon or imagination and what the public discourse should be engaging with on something that's long gone, and look forward and try to think more innovatively and differently. So would be very keen to hear from you on that, as well as anything else that you'd like to reflect on in terms of our economic engagement. And also your thoughts on the question of both India's economic engagements versus our strategic engagement, which drives what? And this big overarching question of, how should China shape our relationships with other countries in the region? Over to you.
Okay, Yamini, again, thank you for pulling all of this together. I've learned so much from these gentlemen and so much just in the course of what they've had to say. So I would almost treat, this window you've given me as the beginning of the discussion, because many of the important points have been made, but I hope I'll add some value as well. There are those associated with CPR who consider any economic engagement with China as appeasement. Okay, I mean, I don't need to name them. I think you know who they are. And so I do immediately need, in a sense, to react to what Ambassador Mohan Kumar has had to say about how I see the relationship with China evolving, although I don't want my remarks to be exclusively on China, because this is about Asia, not just China. But because Galwan, or Ladakh rather, is in the title, my premises have been, some of which are, I think, already being confirmed, uh, that there is an attempt to prevent Ladakh from slipping into war and to try and maintain some kind of separation between security and economics. And in that regard, I have to say that I think that the economic reaction, which I think is unavoidable from our government, has been, sober and mature. I agree with Ambassador Kumar that that the limited trust that the Indian public had in China's word is now eroded, and this is now the political reality for the Modi government. But and I think I'm not putting words in Ambassador Saran's mouth, which is that I don't think that the Indian leadership is about to condemn China as an economic pariah. So my premise, which is personal, but it is also the premise of the paper that I was associated with, which I'll come to in a minute, is that the issue is being clear on our goals as we shape our economic engagement with China and as we shape our economic engagement with the rest of Asia. Now, the other speakers have largely focused on East Asia and the group of countries called ASEAN plus 6, who are the parties to the RCEP. I do believe, though, that the discussion could and should encompass South Asia, because the implications of post-Ladakh are as much for how India is seen in South Asia. And I'm struck, or an analogy, because I once worked on Latin America, that I have is with Brazil, because Brazil, essentially bound itself together with, I think it's got 13 neighbors, through its economic diplomacy, and became the central economy for most of South America. And the issue of whether we have the generosity towards our neighbors in South Asia, Pakistan accepted for obvious reasons, to provide that kind of attractive pull, because that would also, I think, be a way of making ourselves attractive to the rest of the world. So I don't have too much to say on that, but I'm sure that both the ambassadors and maybe Raja as well would want to refer to that. But at this point, I will now shift to East Asia, the context and the paper. So the context of the paper was very much the same as what Shyam Saran had to say, which is that we should have hoped, given the kind of cooperation that we saw at the time of the global financial crisis, that the global community would come together in this much deeper crisis with the same energy and alacrity. But because of the divisions, particularly between the United States and China, we've not seen that. And we've not seen that on the medical front. We're not seeing that even on, who's going to get the first vaccines. So something that demands a truly global response is not getting that. And so the context of the paper, and the people who've registered will see a link on the invitation, was that, look, if there is this kind of division in the world, then there are reasons for thinking that Asia might lead. and it might lead in at least three areas. One is health and mobility associated with health. The second is in financial safety nets. And the third, and only the third, is basically making sure that liberal trade is protected rather than what we also saw in the first stages of the pandemic, which is that it's every person for themselves. And an important theme also in the paper is actually markets for food and food security. So the premise or the pretext was that this is an opportunity for Asia, which is already important in the world, to demonstrate the kind of leadership that we are not seeing. And I would hope that that could also be part of the discussion we could have. Now, I do want to come from that to RCEP as being a symptom of a larger theme or meme in India's engagement, which is that we seem to find it very difficult to, as it were, pull the trigger on trade agreements. I mean, what happened with Prime Minister Modi at Bangkok eerily reminded me of, as it were, the victory speech of Kamal Nath when he said, look, I've showed those people, where they get off. And, let us look at the consequences of that. I don't know if it was on offer in, was it 2006 or 2008? But if that time we had not been interested in grandstanding, but, had pushed, negotiated, done a trade-off, perhaps of agricultural trade for, as it were, services access, mobility of whatever it's called, of
Mode 4, I think.
Mode 4, yeah, H1B. I mean, we wouldn't be faced with, as it were, the arbitrariness of what President Trump is doing today. Now, he could abrogate those understandings. Why am I making this point? I'm making this point because, as it were, I disagree that dealing with dealing through a series of bilaterals is the way to go if you want to establish a set of rules. And if you, in a sense, in these bilaterals, are ultimately looking to dispute resolution through, firstly, I think the bilaterals are going to be, as it were, weak because they are much more subject to domestic lobbies than a regional agreement. And then secondly, I don't know whether dispute resolution in these bilaterals would depend on the WTO or not. And finally, I come to Shyam's point, which is that, for you to think that the big bilaterals to your west would be any more forgiving than what there is in RCEP is, I feel, pie in the sky. I've lost track of whether I've exceeded my time, but let me just, close with a couple of points. I think that Shyam Sadan has made this point several times. We should not be overawed by the present China, okay? If we do the right things, and I'm not sure that we are doing the right things, if we do the right things, it is perfectly possible, given our demographic advantages and our technological edge, for us to replicate the progress of China. But I find it harder to say that we can achieve that by disengaging from China. And I do believe that in that sense, being at the table while China is being engaged is a better way to proceed rather than retreating. Now, I do look to all the countries that Mohan Kumar mentioned as being now, perhaps after some of the bullying in the region, allies of India. I may be wrong, but I think Japan, ASEAN, Australia, Indonesia, our partners in the G20, all of these are quite possibly likely to be more understanding of India's position after Galwan and after what has been happening in the region. But as Shyam said, that the reality may well be that Korea, Japan, maybe even Australia are so so enmeshed with China that that is a pious hope. But I would just close by saying that in every statement that's come out of RCEP after India withdrew, they have repeated that the contracting parties, or whatever they call themselves, are, remain interested in India's engagement. So I think that it is for the trade diplomats and to give substance to that. But I think that to dismiss RCEP as basically an instrument of Chinese denomination is not giving the people in ASEAN and in the other countries who have worked hard at it enough credit. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Suman, for such a important set of pointers and for placing this conversation both in the current context as well as looking broader at the question of our engagements within the region and the question of whether we should be strategically moving in the direction of regional engagements versus bilateral engagements, which is such an important issue that I think we need to debate a little bit further. What I'll do for this next round, since we do already have a flood of questions, is to try and pose the next round of questions to all of you in a way that incorporates some of the questions that has already been posed, and it will sort of allow us hopefully to have as a more robust audience engagement given the limitations of webinars. Raja, let me come to you first and ask you to respond to the question of how should we be thinking about India's engagement with both bilaterally and potentially even through regional engagements in the context of this increasingly aggressive China, that Asia is no longer, in fact, you've written about it as well, the Asian century may well be giving way to the Chinese century. And that poses, and I think some of the questions have been that we've been asked as well as sort of asking this, which is sort of if Southeast Asia decides to align its more strategically in their interest to align further with China, could India risk further isolation? Is that something that we should be thinking about as well? And maybe also for you to reflect a little bit then about this tension between our strategic effort at trying to look at strategic engagements as a substitute for economic engagements, given the tentative approach we have to economic diplomacy more broadly. So over to you.
Yeah. On the first question, I mean, look, I think to talk about ASEAN or East Asia slipping under Chinese hegemony, I think it's quite premature, I think, at this point. Look, I think I've also argued that, look, Asia, if there is one thing common across all of Asia, is nationalism. However much the economic interdependence takes place, this idea that the Japanese, the Koreans, the Indonesians, everyone is going to simply roll over and say, Jai Huzur to the Chinese. I mean, so it is just not going to happen. There is deep economic links, and there are problems, in fact, that they can claim rights in Indonesia's waters. Indonesia is so far from China, at least 1,500 kilometers, and you claim rights in those waters. So the current interdependence, yes, it limits the options of a lot of countries. Mm-hmm. The path dependence of the last 40 years constrains a lot of them. The capital in all these countries would want to make money on China. None of those factors have disappeared. But nationalism is also a powerful force, and that no one, even the smallest country, we've seen from our neighbors, They're not just going to say, look, we have a big neighbor, so now let's just accept his hegemony. So I would say there will be tensions, there will be contradictions. So I think it will be utterly wrong, I think, to just write off East Asia as they're going to just walk into a Chinese lap. So and ASEAN itself, there are divisions, there are fragmentations, given the pressures they face, and differentially. Only some of them have, problems on the territorial side, some don't have. So the answer to this is to stay engaged. I think all the panelists have said, I mean, wherever you can, in whatever form, economically, as well as politically, that until now, it's really ASEAN that gave us the platform. So far, we've been more of a quiet, strange for Indians who are known for their, voice, generally being a reluctant engager in the issues. Well, hopefully, after the current crisis, we'll have things to say, we join the debates and discussions and step up engagement overall. And second, as Mao Zedong long ago said, look, walk on two legs. So I don't think it's a choice that to do only one or the other, that the economic thing can go on in whatever form. And security, look, until recently, we've been reluctant to engage. ASEAN has been saying all the time, please come, we want to see more of you, stay engaged, let's do more exercises. I mean, it's only in the last few years. Otherwise, the resistance in our system to actually do things has been fairly strong. So hopefully now things are changing. So therefore, walking on two legs, both security and economic, both are important. And I think the door is open. The question is how much do we bring to the, how much of energy and bandwidth that we can produce. So I'm not pessimistic that, India is just going to, disappear. That if you make yourself attractive, of course, it's a big if, there will be some reforms. And there I would say even the so-called, good thing about Indians is, whatever slogan they have, it always has multiple meanings.
Yes.
So if, for example, if an Australian company mines, maybe, diamonds in Panna, it is upfront, Atmanirbhar Bharat. Now, if you say, look, maybe a Japanese company can produce weapons in India, of course it is Atmanirbhar Bharat. So I think a strong leadership and a vague slogan actually gives you a lot of room. What is missing in action so far is that political will to change the way you operate. In India, I think the bureaucratic system has limited the potential for domestic capital. It has constrained foreign capital by thousands and thousands of welter of rules. If you start undoing some of that, of just redoing the way you do business, can make a huge difference to how we relate to the others, I think.
So, Ambassador Saran, Raja brings us into a somewhat more optimistic place in that if we have the political will to make the changes that are needed domestically, there is still room for maneuver, and the current crisis, in fact, should push us in the direction of walking on two legs, of rebalancing. Do you see where do you see us going forward, and to what extent do you think this balancing between bilateral, regional should be shaping our strategic direction? But also wanted you to reflect a little bit on how the US plays out in all of this. So over to you. Okay, I think we may have lost.
No, I'm coming.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so let me begin by, since I'm a former bureaucrat, so I cannot let go of this opportunity to respond to some of the blame which is put on the bureaucracy. Having lived through 91, 92, when arguably some very path-breaking reforms were in fact adopted. Let me say that, ultimately it was a political choice, the choice of a political leadership. And I think it should be perhaps recognized that we had a set of people in the bureaucracy who not only deeply believed in taking those reforms forward, but actually made it possible to implement them efficiently. So the critical component here is what the choice of the political leadership is. It's not that the political leadership wants to go in a certain direction and here are these bad, characters sitting in the bureaucracy who are power hungry and who love regulation and they stand in the way. That's simply not true. I mean, that's not the reality. So while it may be very comforting to think that, but for this bureaucracy, everything would be hunky-dory, I'm sorry, the real world simply does not work that way. Secondly, as far as, the question that you raised about the balance between bilateral and, regional, let me point out that with respect to the issue of trade and investment, whatever you may be doing bilaterally, question is what you are able to offer in bilateral context, does that or does that not contradict what may be the responsibilities or commitments which have been made by your trade partners within a regional context? That is, will, say, Japan, will Thailand or ASEAN be able to give you, say, market access, be able to work out, some kind of a reciprocal kind of advantages if this does not conform to the responsibilities and commitments they have made within the regional trading arrangement. So this is another problem which arises, that even the market which you enjoy currently amongst these partner countries may in fact be affected, because obviously those within the agreement will have greater sort of advantage in accessing that bigger regional market. If you are not inside the tent, your access to that market will be on the second rung, not the first rung. So that aspect is sometimes forgotten, that, even the access which you have to those regional markets will be affected if you're not part of the regional arrangement. It's not merely a question of, whether they are getting access to your market and which you are so afraid of. But what about the other side? What about your ability to be able to expand your market in these countries? Now, ultimately, of course, the bottom line is whether or not you are able to undertake the very difficult reforms that are necessary to make India a globally competitive economy. That is why I have said Atmanirbhar Bharat, yes, but only on the very important, assumption that we continue to be committed to making India's economy a globally competitive economy. Because if this ends up by making India, in fact, a high cost, low quality economy, like it was before 91, 92, then you have lost the game. It's as simple as that. So irrespective of whether you are part of a trade agreement or whether the ship has sailed as far as the RCEP is concerned, the bottom line still is that. Are you able to, in fact, create a globally competitive economy, but not, in fact, accept the kind of high quality commitments which are required to be part of a regional, trading arrangement? And as I said, the regional trading arrangement, which is RCEP, imposes the least demands on you compared to other regional. So we have to take that into account. Secondly, it is not my contention that Asia is already lost to China. What I was trying to say was whether it is lost to China in the future will greatly depend upon the choices that countries like India make. So if we say we will not accept a Chinese-dominated Asia, that's very good. I would completely subscribe to that. But then merely saying that is not going to help. Merely even saying that, all of us are nationalists. Of course, we are all nationalists. Of course, we all want to, safeguard our national interests. That is a given. But then, given that sense of national purpose, given the very clear and fierce commitment not to accept a Chinese-dominated Asia, what are you ready to do in order to prevent that from happening? Merely because you make a slogan doesn't mean that it becomes reality. So even when countries in East Asia and Southeast Asia are in fact very nationalist, they do not want a Chinese-dominated Asia. But the question is how much of countervailing power they are able to bring to the table. And how are countries like India, how are countries like, say, the United States of America ready to play that kind of countervailing role? If their sense is that these countries are really not up to the task, it's not a question of saying one day, sorry, I cannot resist Chinese domination, therefore I'm ready to accept a Chinese dominated Asia. No, but we have seen over the last 10 years, 20 years, how incrementally China has been in fact increasing its influence. So there is no doubt that today, with respect to several of the Southeast Asian countries, China has come to a point where it exercises some kind of a veto power over their economic decisions and security decisions. We should, in fact, our effort should be not to make these countries choose between India and China, but in fact, expand their room for maneuver. And you can only expand their room for maneuver if you become a credible and a significant economic as well as security presence in the region. They want you to play that role. That is absolutely right, that what Raja is saying. But you are not somehow up to the game. Part of it is political will, but very importantly, it is also a question of how much economic and security capabilities you bring to this task. And lastly, just to reinforce what Suman said about South Asia itself.
Yes.
I have made this point again and again, and so therefore I don't want to keep repeating it. I have said that unless you get your neighborhood right, any chance of playing any kind of a credible regional role or a global role is simply not going to be possible. But here, the situation is different. Here, unlike in East Asia and Southeast Asia, your neighbors are very heavily dependent upon you as far as their economies are concerned. But they also at the same time regard you as perhaps the main security threat as well of domination. And therefore they try to counterbalance you. So in a sense, it is a symmetrically opposite situation that we find here. But for that very reason, it is absolutely essential that you manage your neighborhood well. And the more dense the economic interdependence is, there will be at least a opportunity to address some of those political issues. I agree that density of economic relations does not necessarily, ameliorate the security, perception, which we see in South Asia itself. But I do think that in managing that kind of a relationship, the density of economic interdependence, together with very good and sometimes even subtle political management, is very important.
Thank you. Mohan, if I could ask you to reflect on what's been said, and particularly on the question of South Asia, and how one should be also thinking about our economic relationships within the region, which, as much as they are dependent on us, China is also becoming increasingly a dominant player. Also your reflections on our on this sort of challenge that Atmanirbhar Bharat sort of poses at one level. There is a compelling reason for India to be more economically engaged within the region and across the globe, and at the same time there are interpretations within India of what it means for India to be self-reliant. So how does this then shape our engagement? Is this new? I mean, in some senses we've always been somewhat tentative on trade, although now it's finding a new political articulation. So just your reflections on the implications of this new political rhetoric, even if it was always the unsaid rhetoric.
Well, thank you. The two-part question, one on South Asia. It's hard to disagree with what Ambassador Shyam Saran or Dr. Raja Mohan has said, which is you have to become an economic powerhouse, at least in South Asia. And if you can do that, and then open up your market access to your neighboring countries. Perhaps the only exception I would make, somewhat controversially again, is Pakistan, because that is a special category all by itself. But for every other country, I completely accept the proposition that's been made, which is that we need to get economics right. We need to be large-hearted. I mean, I remember this is Ambassador Shyam Saran will remember this very well, but this was 20 years ago when I was Joint Secretary. The Bangladeshis were wanting complete free access for their fish and jute. And the kind of things we did in India to make sure the Bangladeshi jute bags would not enter India, I mean, you can write a book on it, and it is complete mean-heartedness on the part of Indian jute manufacturers. So we've done monumental blunders in the past, especially Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. I mean, those are countries with which we should have really, opened up our market access. Now the problem is the boot is on the other foot. I'm sure we may have to go and negotiate market access with Bangladesh for Indian garments because they are far more competitive than India. So anyway, but the basic proposition that you need to really open up your market for your neighboring countries, number one. Number two, I must tell you that in the RIS, the energy area, we are doing a lot of good things with Nepal, Bhutan. Work that was initiated under the leadership of Ambassador Shyam Saran when he was Foreign Secretary, but we have taken it forward. So energy, South Asia Energy Group that we are just going to establish in RIS is doing a lot of things with Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and India. That is doing a lot of good work. So energy is an area where South Asian... So my point of view now is to make my final point on this particular segment. I think we should forget about forums and not talk about SAARC and BIMSTEC and so on. Just pick areas like the energy area that we have chosen. So pick energy, pick public health, pick border infrastructure, pick, power plants if you like, whatever you want, climate change, and then let us do cooperation sectorally on the basis of those who are willing to do it. That seems to me a better way forward, but I have no difficulty with the proposition that really India should go all out to its neighbors in terms of even sacrificing a little bit, frankly, because that is necessary, I think. So that point, I think I would like to make. On the other question that you asked, which was about China, isn't it? India, China? I'm sorry. Yeah. So see, my way of looking at it is that I'm not suggesting we bring down the relationship with China to zero. In any case, that is impossible. But it has been largely unregulated. To depend on China for 80% of your antibiotics, 80% of power equipment, 80% solar panels is, I think, wrong. Your whole hosiery industry in Tirupur is now waiting for zippers and buttons to come from China, and they can't export because they say we don't have zippers and buttons, and they are blocked. The consignment is blocked in ports and so on. So I mean, in this area, I don't mind if Atmanirbhar can help us kind of up our game and reduce our dependence. That's fine. But I don't believe Atmanirbhar in that sense extends to anything beyond, for example, if you take the example of active pharmaceutical ingredients, 10 years ago, they were all manufactured in India. We were manufacturing them. But then China came and did what is known as plug and play, which is they give you land, they give you power, they give you infrastructure. All our chaps fled there. They said it's far better to kind of invest there and do it there because it is 30% less. It's like the Indian garment manufacturers who are now fleeing to Bangladesh, who are saying it makes more sense to invest in Bangladesh than in India. So there I agree with others. We go back to this first proposition that Raja Mohan made, which is you not just make India attractive, make India an unbeatable proposition for investment. And this, I think, if we don't do it during this crisis, I have grave doubts we will ever do it, frankly, because this offers a perfect opportunity to do land, labor, transaction costs. For example, industrialists to whom we supply power in India, we charge them way too much so that we can subsidize our farmers and other consumers. I mean, we are the only country which does that. So we overcharge power rates for our industrialists because you have to do cross-subsidization. Immediately put an end to it because all the industrialists are complaining for too much power. Environmental clearances took 3 years, 5 years ago. You know, it's come down now. But if you're going to take 3 years for granting an environmental clearance for a project, 4 years for acquisition of land, nobody is going to invest. That's the bottom line. So I think some of these internal reforms are long overdue. And to go back to this saying by an American, I think never allow a crisis to go waste. If we can get these reforms right, I mean, India has certain basic advantages that we can easily attract FDI if only we can get land, labor, transaction costs, energy right. We're just talking 4 or 5 reforms. Everything else is fine. They will put up with India because the market is so big. So I think those, if we can combine those reforms with Atmanirbhar in some specific areas, I would have no problem. And as Raja Mohan says, Atmanirbhar can be interpreted in 100 different ways in India. So it's okay. It doesn't bother me that much. I also don't believe, frankly, that we are going back to the 1930s or even to pre-1991. I really, sincerely don't believe that. Everybody I have spoken to in the government, there is nobody who says we are trying to go back to pre-91. So.
Sure. Thank you so much. Suman, I'm going to ask you to put on your domestic economist hat for a moment, as well as sort of respond to some of the larger geo-economic questions that have been posed. I mean, all our speakers have all made a very strong case for the need for India to clear what Manish Sabharwal calls our regulatory cholesterol, for, doing, Mohan just, mentioned the critical issue of power subsidy reform, factor market reforms of all kinds. I mean, there are good reasons why some of these things have not been done, and then there are larger political reasons why some of these things have not been done. And the conversation inevitably ends up getting stuck right there. So how do we think about economic reforms differently for India? Do we need to change the nature of the public discourse around it? Just some reflections from you on that, because it seems very clear that we can't be thinking of the global conversation without talking more seriously about the internal conversation. And secondly, also, there have been quite a flurry of questions around RCEP, asking panelists to reflect a little bit on why India chose not to accept RCEP, but also whether trade agreements with, bilateral agreements, as has already been discussed, but specifically with countries like Australia, may be an urgent alternative as we recalibrate what our regional engagement would be like. So since your report looked very specifically at our economic engagements within the region outside of China, it'd be useful to hear your comments on some of these questions.
Thanks for both those. Am I mute? How much time are we left with, Yamini? Is that a constraint?
We have 5 minutes, and then so if you could speak for 5 minutes, and then I'll ask all the panelists to just give a 2-minute closing before we finish. We have about 10 minutes before we close.
Okay, well, thanks.
Look, I asked you a big question, and now I'm giving you very little time.
No, so, but it's, you've allowed me to make a point that I wanted to, but didn't out of time, which is that we have certainly, had a rough couple of years on the economy, even before COVID. But, let me remind all of us that for whatever reason, and success has many parents, India's economic performance overall has been a success for a quarter of a century. Okay, so I mean, Arvind Virmani is the person who keeps updating this, and we have been amongst the, if growth is a metric, one of amongst the fastest growing economies for a long time. What that says to me is that there's a system there which on the whole manages to generate increases in productivity over time, which I think then reinforces the point that Shyam has been making, which is that there are political choices, but there is a system at work as well. And if I could refer now to Raja, I mean, when he talked about in Crossing the Rubicon, talking about the way the system dealt with the U-turn on foreign policy after the collapse of the Soviet Union, again, the system is responsive. So it's a responsive system, and I would argue it's on the whole a successful system. And this was very much a perspective I got when I was working at Shell. Because, Indians always think of themselves as somehow idiosyncratic. It turns out that for many things, we are sort of middle of the road. Point number one. Point number two, we are in severe danger of, as it were, learning the wrong lessons from President Trump. Okay? He is fixated on bilateral trade deficits, and he regards those in defiance of any economic logic as a sign of immiserizing engagement. Okay, you talk to any economist and he will say to you that a bilateral trade deficit is not something you should be focused on. People would then argue, oh, well, the problem is that overall India has a large trade deficit, to which the response is yes, because we have substantial surplus on services. Merchandise trade, I should have said. We have a substantial surplus and comparative advantage in services, and we have huge unrequited flows of transfers because of our migrants abroad. Okay, so what economists would look at is the overall balance of payments. And our overall balance of payments has been, under control with a few exceptions. Now, you have to choose. Either you are with Ambassador Mohan Kumar, who basically argues that we are in a world of strategic trade, not liberal trade. And you had better be strategic in the way in which you manage technology, you manage FDI, etc. And, you pay your money, you take your choice. I don't think the government has quite made up its mind where it is with Atmanirbhar. For myself, I tend to think that liberal economics has done pretty well for India, and there's no particular reason to toss it out the window, because I'm with Shyam on this one. Globalization is not going to go into reverse in a hurry. We have huge comparative advantage, and dare I say it, our economy is complementary with the Chinese economy. They have a surplus of savings, we have a deficit of savings, they're good at infrastructure, we're not so good at infrastructure. So, those are the underlying realities, how we can get a gravitational assist from China rather than walling ourselves off. On FTAs, as it were, versus bilaterals, an important point which predates this government by far, is that people want people look to participation in FTAs in order to provide policy stability, okay, so that there is a clear glide path. Now, India, when we started to liberalize trade in the early 90s, we were very committed to the idea that we wanted to get to ASEAN levels of protection. We gave our private sector guidance that tariff rates were going to come down over time. And as I say, I mean, we happened to also participate in the global boom, but government after government was committed to that. I think we basically lost our stride in the global financial crisis. And quite why, as it were, we felt that we could not go down that path, I don't know. But that momentum has been lost, and I think it has been costly to us. I would also say that a nostrum of that era, that once India gives you its word, it sticks to it. It may take time. I mean, I think that the move to retroactive taxation that took place I think soon after the global financial crisis, I think that was very damaging. So when we talk about regulatory cholesterol, I do think that providing consistent a long-term perspective is important. Now, the question I have for the other worthies on the panel is, why is it that the Indian system uniquely seems to find it so difficult to pre-commit to a future policy path? I mean, I remember a discussion at NCAR in the India Policy Forum where people were making this argument that, the whole point about entering into a trade agreement is that you then bind yourself to a particular policy path. And I remember Montek basically arguing, frankly, the nature of the Indian policy process doesn't allow our politicians to commit themselves. And one reason they like the WTO is because there's this massive gap between bound and applied tariffs, and they can do whatever they please. And that's not the kind of latitude that they're going to be given in FTAs. So they shrink from FTAs. I don't know if that's right or if that's wrong. But I would say that given that India has blotted its copybook over the last decade in being a reliable partner, in using discretion for all kinds of reasons, that strikes me as one reason why we should consider ourselves a middle power, as Raja Mohan calls, and join other middle powers, to, as it were, tame the beasts in the system, which are the United States and China. I think I've overrun my 5 minutes, but I couldn't resist, the platform you gave me.
Thank you. Thank you. We're very much at the end of this conversation, and I'd like to invite all the panelists to just, offer 2-3 minutes of closing remarks. There are a number of questions specifically to the Galwan incident and India-China relations in the long run. This wasn't meant to be a discussion on the strategic issues, so we haven't picked up on them. But if you'd like to reflect on the link between what's happened and the larger economic diplomacy question, please do so in your remarks. So Raja, we can start with you and go the same way.
Yamini, I think as I said, the Galwan crisis, I think, is giving us an opportunity, I think, to redo both your foreign economic and foreign policies of how you relate to a world that is changing. So I'll just say 3 quick things. I think one on the global context. I think if you put politics in command, which is an unpredictable commodity, so it's not a question whether globalization is reversible or not. If politics forces things, stuff happens. So I think, I believe the globalization, as we have known, the hyper-globalization of open borders, where capital and labor are going to be completely free to move across borders, that phase has come to an end, and there will be some rearrangement of the globalization process, a renegotiation of the terms of this engagement, partly because of economic reasons, because it's produced disaffection, and second, because China has gained disproportionately relative to the others, so therefore there will be pressure to rearrange the global system. And I see that as an opportunity rather than as a problem. Second, I think on the foreign policy side, today, after 30 years of growth, we are in a much better position than we were in '91. That we have, while the China crisis has put us in a really bit of a problematic mode, but today your leverages, your capacities, your engagement with other powers is in a much better shape than in 1991. Therefore, the crisis, I think, is going to compel us into adapting. And there again, I think it is the question of how much boldness we can show. And finally, the trick to reconcile these two is really the economic policy. I'm not an expert on that. That 91 is no longer possible. India just opens up without letting domestic liberalization expand. That is, if you differentiate maybe between globalization and domestic liberalization, liberalization within home, where it is possible for capital, for entrepreneurship to thrive, I think we can change the terms of equation of how we've related to the world. And I think today we don't have much of a choice. A more aggressive domestic liberalization and unleashing the domestic productive forces help us, I think, navigate a far more complex dynamic and turn it to our advantage rather than retreat completely from where we've been so far.
Thank you. Ambassador Saral?
Yeah, thank you. I just use these 2-3 minutes to address something that you raised, but I did not respond to, which is, does US fit into all this? And we begin by saying that my own experience has been that in terms of managing the China challenge, stronger relations that India has with the United States of America helps rather than hinders the management of the Chinese challenge. So I have not much patience with the argument that we should somehow increase our distance from the United States of America because this will somehow assuage Chinese fears about India. It is quite the contrary in my experience. The more isolated you are, the more vulnerable you become. So having strong relationship with the United States of America, dysfunctional as it may be at this point of time, it remains the world's formidable economic and military power. And hopefully when the elections take place, we may have perhaps a less dysfunctional United States, for the next few years. So that is something which I consider to be an important learning. Second, that again, in terms of being able to have some kind of a countervailing presence in what we now call the Indo-Pacific, the role of strong security arrangements among India, the US, Japan, and Australia, and hopefully expanding this to include even some other key players like Indonesia, like Vietnam. This will be very helpful to India in terms of dealing with the China challenge. Now, with regard to what Raja Mohan mentioned about the walking on two legs policy, of course, that has been the main assumption behind India's China policy for the last several years, that we have tried to, work together with China in areas where there are convergences of interest. And while we have confronted China, and I must say this very clearly, that whenever Indian interests have been threatened, India has not hesitated to confront China. So there has been this walking on two legs policy, and much of what the Southeast Asian countries or East Asian countries are doing is also precisely the same kind of approach. I think the problem arises when somehow this walking on two legs becomes very difficult if one leg is constantly attacked by the other side, and to make you lame. So we have to find a way to be able to deal with that. And the last point I would make is, because I think this is important, India has very substantial assets in being able to, in fact, put itself on a trajectory to become, to my mind, and again, something I have repeated, if there is any country in the world today, which in terms of its population, its area, its economic potential, its military potential, its scientific and technological capabilities, which is able to match or even surpass China, it is only India. I don't see any other power being able to achieve that. So that to me is a given. But to get to that point, the trajectory that you need to traverse in order to get there is something which depends upon choices that you make today. So having that confidence is very important. And as I have also pointed out, one of the biggest assets is the attractiveness of India as a very vibrant, successful multi-party democracy. This is a point of distinction from China, which makes us more attractive compared to what China is. And we should not underrate what people may call the soft power, but I consider to be perhaps intangible, but in fact a very, very important asset. Thank you.
Thank you. Mohan?
Thank you very much. No, really cannot disagree with what has been said before me, but I would say just 3 points from my side. Internally, I think we just need to reform. I think this crisis offers a perfect opportunity to reform We reform better under compulsion than out of conviction. So the government and the political leadership must take the lead. I don't think there is any need for widespread consultation. Everybody knows what are the important areas where reforms needs to be done. I think they just need to be done without any further ado. That's one. Secondly, as far as external trade is concerned, I also believe that you cannot become a 5 trillion, 8 trillion, whatever trillion economy unless you double your exports. The only difference I have with people is that I think we need to make a strategic decision about where we can export more. My personal view, and I don't want to conclude this program with another controversial input, but nevertheless, I'll say it. I still believe we are more likely to export much more to the West than the East. This is my personal view. You know, given the non-tariff barriers we have faced in China, given the fact that they export a lot of things that we do, and given the fact that with ASEAN, we have tried out an FTA, we have reached the limits, I do believe we will export much more to the West. If that assumption is correct, we have to get into some trading arrangement with them, whether we like it or not. And if it means inflicting pain on ourselves, you have to do it. On China, I really have no problem. I think China is on the verge of a very, very important decision. They have to decide what kind of an Asia they want. Rather than ask India what kind of an Asia we want, we should be asking China whether they want a China-centric Asia or not. Everything they've done post-corona leads me to believe they want a China-centric Asia. I hope better wisdom prevails, because I don't believe India will have a problem with the polycentric Asia. It's fine. And it doesn't mean we're going to cut off all economic trade relationships with China. Nobody's saying that. Lastly, I actually like this idea put forward by somebody, I can't remember. The foreign policy objective of India has got to be 8% growth, economic growth. Without that, really, all your objectives of whatever you do in security and strategic areas falls by the wayside. So I cannot overemphasize the importance of economics when it comes to achieving your strategic objectives. Thank you.
Thank you. Suman, over to you for the last word. You're on mute.
3 quick points. One is, yes, I mean, I'm overjoyed to see the amount of support that I'm getting from the security folk on the economy. Let me just, remind ourselves of the enormity of what India is going through on COVID. Okay, so we're talking for the medium term, but the question of what it is meet and reasonable to expect the government to be doing. Maybe this is what you mean by the crisis, but let's also be aware of the enormous humanitarian kind of challenge facing the government. So I just wanted to make that point, which is also relevant to the paper that was cited. Secondly, for the globe, we are talking in Asia of certainly the largest, the second largest, or well, largest actually, the third largest and the fourth largest economies in the world, as measured by the IMF. So this is consequential. I mean, China, Japan, India on PPP terms now being bigger than Japan. And so they, for a world which is kind of stumbling economically, this is part of the argument for coming together in Asia to help the world at this moment of economic crisis. And third, I would also note that we have accepted to be the G20, to accept the G20 presidency in, 2022, I think, followed by Indonesia. And, I think that taking an interest in the kind of global governance issues that Shyam was talking about earlier, and projecting those as important even domestically, rather than as a sideshow, I think is something that is linked up with the kind of sense of gravitas, if you like, that India needs to convey. So I think that there are all these reasons for India to indicate that it is a serious Asian player. Whether that requires RCEP or not, that's for others to gauge. But I think that for India to show itself as an Asian leader and for Asia to show itself as capable of leading globally, I think are very important. And I think that I'm very grateful to you, Yamini, for brokering a conversation of this depth and quality. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. I think this has, as expected, been a really, really insightful and enlightening conversation. I think the importance of our economic future linked to our geostrategic future was such a central point of consensus amongst all of you, and such a critical point, I think, that needs to be re-emphasized in our public debate. I do think, as Suman, you rightly pointed out, that the COVID crisis, the humanitarian crisis that the government confronts is going to play an important role in shaping our economic response, both domestically as well as then repositioning ourselves. And this has to move beyond the sort of polemic of Atmanirbhar and so on. And I do think that there is actually, I'm not sure that the consensus on reforms, as Mohan, you said, is fully there. In fact, I think a lot of questions are open for, there were lots of things we didn't do that we never brought into the debate on what should be reformed and how it should be reformed in the immediate aftermath of the 1991 opening up, that do need to be confronted head on, and that will shape how we deal with the big questions of factor market reforms that will open up or liberalize the domestic economy, as Raja was saying. And I think the reminder that Ambassador Saran brought to the table, that the real hard power of India is our democracy, is something that we can't forget in the context of that conversation. And that certainly does mean that some of the economic reforms we need to do domestically are going to be almost more challenging, combined with the challenge that COVID presents us. But all this together should be a reminder that India's strategic role will definitely be shaped by how we clear up our domestic house, and that's so critical to where our future lies. Thank you all, and a warm welcome back to many of you onto the CPR platform, and a special welcome to Mohan for the first time, I think, back at CPR, and look forward to having you all back again soon enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank
Right.
you.
Thank you,
Yamini.
panelists. Right.
All the best.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, sir. See you.